Graham Houlder, Managing Director of Sloop, who offers consulting services, project management, and tools related to making packaging more sustainable. Project Coordinator for Ceflex, presenting why the plastic circular economy needs to be demand-driven to be sustainable, and what we all need to do to realize it.
Good morning. Do we have some slides? We do have some slides. We have progress, and it's my pleasure to be here to talk to you. I have to admit, it's a black hole out there. Can't see anybody, but hopefully you can see me, and hopefully you can hear me. But I'd like to start with a big thank you to Safripol. It's a real pleasure to be able to address you today. And what I'm going to present is a work in progress. You heard from Annabe that it's a work in progress here. So you're not alone. This is a challenge that's happening all the way around the world. And I have the privilege of leading this project called the Ceflex project. And what it is a collaboration of companies looking at how you make flexible packaging materials circular in Europe. And some people say, well, I thought you'd already done that. No, we've got a long way to go still. So we have the full value chain represented equally. So we have the material producers, equivalents of Safripol, but all of the big ones that operate globally. We have the big brand owners, we have the converters, make the packaging. We don't have retailers buying into this in Europe, I'll be quite honest, but it's our intention to engage with them. We have the end-of-life resorting, collection, sorting, recycling companies, and we have what we call the eco chain, which is the EPR systems, the people who make the recycling machinery, but also the packaging machinery, and basically everything in between. It's a very rich group of people. So when we started this back in 2017, we set ourselves this mission, which we call Mission Circular, and it starts with the how do you make a circular economy for flexible packaging? You need to collect it, not rocket science, and I'm glad to hear there's a big focus on that here. You need to make sure that at least the majority of it, we said 80% of materials goes back into the circular economy, so into a recycling process so that it can be recycled. And the third point, which hadn't really been focused on until then, is that you need to create a market for these materials. Somebody wants to use it, because if you're recycling and nobody wants to use it, then why are you doing it? It's just costing money. So those were the three elements that we had as our mission circular. We started off with the let's collect, sort, recycle, redesign, and end markets as our overview. But over the last 6 years, we've really fine-tuned that into groups of activities that are all necessary to realize the circular economy for flexible packaging. So we have the what you put onto the market, which is really about the design, but it's also about who's using these materials. Then you talk about how do you get them, once they become waste, through the system to become new materials. So this collection, sorting, recycling, because that if you don't have that in place, it's not going to work. But you also have the third block, which is about how do you make it work economically? Who conducts this system? And EPR systems is one way of doing it. It's the way we prefer in Europe, but it's gaining momentum outside of Europe as well. And they put in place the systems that enable there to be enough money in the system to pay for the collection, sorting, and recycling. There we go. That's the light blue box at the bottom. And then the fourth thing is about how do we keep the whole system honest? So if I'm a big brand owner and I want to show that I'm doing the right thing, and I run off and use recycled materials, the recycled materials is more expensive than the virgin materials, I'm not going to do that for very long before my head of finance or my finance VP comes and says, our competition didn't follow. And now we're hemorrhaging our profitability. So we're going to have to stop doing that. And this is where the legislation comes in, because it needs to set the level playing field and police the level playing field to make sure that if you don't actually do it, then there's a quid pro quo, you're penalized for it, because we need everybody to move as one. So those are the 4 main points. We've distilled it a bit further into what we call the demand-driven circular economy model for flexible packaging in Europe. And I would go as far as to say that if you take nothing else away from this presentation today, think this hopefully provides you a framework to visualize what's needed to build the circular economy for flexible packaging. So the first thing you need to understand, the CE for FP is the circular economy for flexible packaging. Yeah, you need to know what's going on to the market. With flexible packaging, this is incredibly difficult, but I would argue it's not simple for any plastic packaging materials out there, because you might know what the base polymer is, but you don't know what else is in there as well. So you do need to know what's going on to the market. And people talk about multi-material flexible packaging, huge challenge. In Europe today, the flexible packaging, consumer flexible packaging market is actually 60% monomaterial already. We know how to recycle that. It's not rocket science. If you add the commercial and industrial, so the transport packaging and stuff onto that, which is probably about 40% of the market, it's all LDPE. There's very little contamination in that. So most of this flexible packaging is eminently monomaterial, which we can collect and recycle it. But it's very important to understand what goes onto the market, because guess what? That's what's coming back from the market. That's what is going to have to be recycled. That's what you're going to have to find end markets to actually use those materials. Those end markets determine the quantities and the qualities that you need to make it into. So these materials that come back from the market have to be offered to these end markets in the right quantities and qualities. The work we've done on flexible packaging is indicating that for the LDPE films out there, because such a huge quantity is in food contact, there is insufficient end markets if we made these materials circular. Today, no issues. There's plenty end markets to be used, but if you're starting with the end game in mind, then you need to bear in mind that actually there's only a third of the market can use non-food contact LDPE materials. And most of that goes back into film applications, because the end markets for LDPE back into rigids, pretty limited. Once you understand the end markets, you know what kind of recycling facilities you need. How much mechanical recycling, how much film to film, how much film to rigid, and more importantly, food contact. We can't currently do food contact recycled polyolefin materials. So the only way we know how to do it, and this is not commercial at scale anywhere in the world yet, is via chemical recycling, but hopefully that's going to change very soon. So there's a huge pull, because if we want to make these materials circular, we need chemical recycling in addition to mechanical recycling. Mechanical recycling probably first, because it has a lower cost, lower environmental impact. So let's focus on filling those end market opportunities first, before we go into the chemical recycling. But like all things, these things go up in parallel with each other. Once you understand the recycling pathways, then sorting, yes, what kind of bales do mechanical recyclers need? How much contamination can they accept? And the same goes for chemical recycling, which is a whole new ball game, because we don't have much experience there at all. And then how do you collect it? And I think Anabe's presentation outlined the challenges there. We need to get it collected. And there's no one size fits all here. It's about how you get access to that material. Do you do it at curbside? Do you do it at the collection facility? Do you do it from a mixed waste stream? Do you do it from a separately collected recyclable stream? No right answers there. So that's the demand-driven part. The second couple enablers are what we call the enablers. This is about designing for a circular economy. So DFR, we call it D for ACE and CFlex, design for a circular economy, because what you put onto the market determines the costs and your ability to bring it back from the market. So design is incredibly important, and we need to bear that in mind. The third point is extended producer responsibility. For me, this is the key piece of the puzzle. If we don't get this right, it's not going to work. And I say get it right, and I'm going to come back to this later as to what EPR is and how it's structured today and what's necessary. But that's the money that makes the merry-go-round. And if the things have a value, they will get collected, provided that there's sufficient value for the people doing the collection, and the sorting, and the recycling. And if there's enough money in the system, then marketing can say, oh, this recycled material is cheaper than the virgin material. 5% cheaper? I'll have it, please. I'll bite your arm off to get it. So EPR is absolutely key, but I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. And then legislation, and that's where I'm going to start today, because legislation is a difficult topic. Nobody wants it, but it's very important. So then, of course, you need to communicate, you need to collaborate, and you need to measure progress. But coming back to legislation, some of you will have heard that we have some new proposed packaging legislation in Europe today. It's called the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. It replaces the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which was quite groundbreaking legislation in its day and has been replicated in many countries around the world. And I gather many elements of that have actually found their way into South African legislation as well. This proposal is a game changer. It is moving from basically a linear economy to what's needed to become circular in one step. So although you can't see it here, we're talking about packaging restricting certain formats. So choice editing, what you're allowed to put onto the market and what the consumer is allowed to use. And that's to prevent more materials, more plastic materials being put onto the market. Then we get into the design for recycling, the recyclability and recycled content. We're getting mandatory DFR criteria. So if you don't meet the DFR criteria, you're not allowed on the market. If you don't have enough recycled content, then you either pay a fine or you're not allowed on the market. But there's all sorts of other things in there in terms of linking the percentage raw materials that you actually need back to EPR fees that the materials pay, which is called eco-modulation. EPR is getting a lot more teeth, which we're very happy about. And countries are increasingly relying on deposit return schemes, which are not without their own problems. If you're a flexible packaging circular economy, and you take all the PET bottles out the chain, well, guess what? It just became a whole lot more expensive to collect the flexible packaging and transport it and ship it because the PET is not in there. So the high-value materials. So no change to the recycling targets. The targets in Europe today are at 50% for plastic packaging by 2025 and 55% by 2030. And then we get into the reuse and enforcement areas. But the main thing I want to focus on there is that there is a ban being proposed. We haven't dealt with this before. Yes, certain areas like the single-use plastic directives have proposed bans in very restricted areas. This is mainstream, so very important. So moving then on to the how we make it. This is how the legislation is going to help us in CFlex deliver the circular economy for flexible packaging. Firstly, DFR. It's about what goes onto the market. We have recycled content that's going to be creating a pull for these materials from the end markets, including packaging end markets. Then we have recycling pathways, and this is about including in that regulation a definition for recycled at scale. That means we're going to need mechanical recycling and chemical recycling to meet those targets, and it's going to be written into the legislation so people get the guarantees that their investments in these capabilities and capacities is going to be well-founded. Things like digital watermarking, I don't know whether you've heard about this, but instead of relying on a near-infrared or an operator to understand what the plastic is in the packaging, you do this automatically by just scanning the pack. It's got an invisible barcode on it everywhere around on the pack, and the camera says, oh, I know exactly what you are. You're a 95% PE film, and you've got a 3% EVOH, and this is the kind of ink system that you've got. And you go into this bale, and then when the recycler buys the bale, he says, oh, I know exactly what I've got, so I'll mix that very pure bale with that not so pure bale, and I get a very consistent quality. So a very interesting technology which we're hoping is going to be commercialized soon in Europe. Separate collection, new targets on that, and no derogation allowed, or very difficult to get a derogation if you don't currently do separate collection. And then on the EPR side, lots of developments there which are quite promising, including fee modulation and some more controlled authentication processes for the packaging recovery organizations, or PROs, as they've been referred to. So that's one piece of legislation. It's proposed. It's not in law yet, but we're concerned that it may even go further than that once it gets passed, comes back from the European Parliament. So watch this space. Food contact legislation. I mentioned the difficulties in recycling polyolefins, and polyolefins are the workhorse polymers in flexible packaging. Some big changes in the legislation, mainly moving away from local member state or country level regulations to for the whole of Europe, which is quite a challenge. Then we need to set up methods to identify how we quantify and track the materials coming back from chemical recycling. We've got hardly any chemical recycling capacity on the ground yet, but if you're going to want to claim recycled content and use that back in food contact because you have recycled content obligations, and they're not small, then you need a method to do that, and that's called a mass balance with certification, and that needs to be developed and approved and be implemented Europe-wide. And I'm guessing that that approach will probably be picked up and launched elsewhere in the world. And then we have the waste shipment regulation, which is all about keeping the materials in Europe so that we can recycle them there. And that's due later on this year. So huge environment portfolio there. I've said there, I crossed out needs to support, because that's what the directive did. It was supporting moving in the right general direction. This regulation proposal is not pretending anymore. This is going to drive circularity into the system. I've showed you the main areas in those two bullets there, and spelling out that if you don't meet this by 2030, well, you're just not allowed on the market. That's it. Nowhere on the European market will you be able to sell that product. So you might be able to sell it in neighboring countries that aren't part of Europe, but if it's made there and you try and import it into Europe, not allowed, sorry. So, I mean, it's a huge step change. My conclusion for C-Flex, this is really like the wind in our sails. This is setting a new level playing field, and very good news. But I'm not afraid to admit that this is going to be a huge challenge for our stakeholders who participate in the C-Flex project. This is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to require everybody to collaborate and push in the right direction across industries which don't necessarily collaborate with each other. They normally compete with each other. And then I put in there green, well, where next? Is this coming to South Africa? We already see bits of the proposal appearing in other African state proposed legislations. So even though it's not even legislation in Europe, it's already becoming legislation in other countries. So watch this space. So that is the legislation side of things. Quickly about extended producer responsibility. I understand it's a fairly new concept in South Africa and only recently become part of the law. It is how we're going to, if the legislation levels the playing field, EPR is about implementing it and making sure that it actually happens. So it's run by PROs, packaging recovery organizations. It sets the standards by what gets collected by the municipalities, how it's collected, because you don't collect it that way, you don't get paid. And it makes sure there's enough money in the system. And that money in the system comes from normally paid by the brand owners for each piece of packaging that's put onto the market. And the EPR system that says, well, I'll pay this amount to you to collect that material, this amount to you to sort it, and then, depending on the country, either paying directly to the recyclers or paying more money to the sorters so that the recyclers can get the material at a subsidized rate. But the principal design system today is how do we make this system meet the targets, the legal targets today, which are about 22.5% for plastic, but are going to be 50% by 2025, so a big jump. How do we meet those targets at the lowest cost? And that's the issue, because when you're doing anything at the lowest cost, it's difficult to do things better in the future. So in terms of summarizing the roles, it's how do you set and manage the EPR fees? How do you decide what packaging gets collected and how it gets sorted and recycled? These are key roles of EPR systems that have to be specified, agreed with industry and agreed with the municipalities who are doing the collection, and then implemented at scale. So very important role that EPR has to play in this. We think you need to go one step further, or probably we call it criteria to make these materials circular, criteria for circularity. Eco-modulation, now part of the regulation. It's important to incentivize good design and penalize poor design, so that people say, well, actually it's going to cost me less to do the right thing than just buying the cheapest low-quality multi-material mix and putting that into the market. It needs to be funded, not just to meet the minimum recycling target, but to fund it to deliver circularity. But it also needs to be funded to avoid, to be competitive, so recycled materials are competitive with virgin. If it's more important and more expensive than virgin, then people aren't going to really want to use it unless they're forced to by legislation. If it's cheaper, as I said earlier, they'll bite your arm off to get it. And from experience, 5% discount on the virgin price, reliable quantities and qualities, most end markets will take advantage of those opportunities. The other thing we need to avoid is, in Europe in particular, flexible packaging. We've been paying EPR fees for a long time. It's still not widely collected, sorted, and recycled. So where did that money go? Oh, it was going to collect and sort and recycle glass, paper, rigid plastics. And those are the very same industries that turn around and say, oh, you've got no infrastructure, very difficult to be recycled. But meanwhile, they've been using the money from EPR fees from flexible packaging to develop their own and subsidize their own industries. So no cross-format subsidization. I'm very pleased to see that you have separate collection targets for flexible packaging in this country. So as I said, EPR levels the playing field. It's I'm claiming that it's the conductor of the orchestra. They decide how this whole thing works. They allocate the waste streams, because once you go circular, and there's a lot of demand for waste, and who gets access to which waste at which qualities. And somebody's got to make that call, and I would propose it's the EPR system. So just to summarize, legislation sets the level playing field and how high it is. EPR system makes sure that it works and is complied with and is economically viable to do it. And in Europe, what's on the table today in terms of proposed legislation, it's still level for all of the actors in the value chain, but the level just went very, very high. And just by way of trying to illustrate a point, in 2018, 22.5% recovery rate, 2030, more than double that. And equivalent to meet those targets, you're going from a linear economy to a circular economy in one giant step. And with that, I'd like to stop and thank you very much for listening. Very happy to answer any questions as to how what I've presented might be relevant in the South African economy.